Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, germs, and everything in between. This is a new weekly radio show exploring the intersection between politics, philosophy, spirituality, and pop culture in our contemporary society.
I have the right to do whatever I want as president.
Senseless violence and senseless tragedy.
Uninformed opinions.
Yes, welcome. This is Uninformed Opinions. I am your host. You know, what's the point of this, right? Who doesn't have a podcast? Who doesn't have a radio show? What value can this voice bring to listening ears? Truth be told, I don't know. I am content with this going nowhere. I am content with this being heard by no one. I am content with anonymity. I am content with failure, right? If that's how we want to judge success in this environment, right? This thing. I come from a background from the South that informs a lot of who I am, right? And as this show goes on, we'll get to know each other. I should say, you'll get to know me. You will learn things as time goes on. Each episode will have a focus. It'll have a central discussion from which we will operate from. Last weekend was the Oscars. Today is March 20th, 2026, just before noon. Last week we had the Oscars. And the discourse around that has always was terrible, awful, disgusting. Makes one uninterested in being part of some of these communities. And it's always telling because so many people have opinions that they think are informed. And a lot of people do have informed opinions. But, go on TikTok. And is there a community on TikTok for film analysis? I don't know. Today, I would like to discuss One Battle After Another and Sinners. Two films widely recognized as, at least at the Oscars, right? The top two films of the years, right? These two films were in competition with each other. And when there's a competition, there are teams, right? I got my team. My fiance B has their team. And there's conflict often in competition. I'm not sure conflict is inherent with competition, but it's a natural outgrowing, right? This competition brings out the worst. Film discourse, I think, film analysis. I especially in this conversation, but even moving forward, I would like to really put an emphasis on intersectionality and taking a holistic approach to things, right? We do this in politics. We do it in religion, right? We do it in philosophy. There's an argument to be had. Philosophy is exactly intersectionality and holistic approaches. How does this apply to these movies? It is very easy to take our political beliefs, our political opinions, our political thought that may be, not really ours, right? And placing that onto the film that we are watching, whatever it may be, and if I'm liking the movie, then the movie's in agreement with my politics. If I'm not liking the movie, it's in opposition to my politics. And I think we have to be careful there. We have to be careful applying political theory to film with no film theory. We can draw on many different political theories to inform the analytical framework through which we critique films. We should. There is valid and correct critiques through the lens of black feminism with One Battle After Another, right? Very fair, fair's the wrong word there. We can also look at One Battle After Another through a liberal lens, right? And I'm going to try to demonstrate this as we move forward. But we cannot ignore the film itself as a moving picture. We cannot ignore what it means, what a point of view shot means. A character's, the camera lens becoming the character's point of view versus the point of view of the cinematographer or the director is a significant thing that, of course, would change the analysis and critique of certain scenes. And, just to jump right into it, we're going to start with One Battle After Another. There is a frequent example used to demonstrate OBAA's maybe racism. And this is the scene in which Lockjaw is kind of stalking Perfidia, and he's watching her from afar, and the camera jumps into his point of view, and he sees Bob like grabbing Perfidia's ass or whatever, right? There's a lot to unpack in this moment. Where is the objectification coming from? That is what we need to analyze in this scene to determine if Paul Thomas Anderson is pushing a racist narrative. So what is the camera doing? Right, let's start there. As I said, it is the point of view shot of Lockjaw, right? We are taking into the world of Lockjaw. We are observing Perfidia as Lockjaw observes her. It makes us uncomfortable, probably. Hopefully, it should. This is the PTA is using the camera to actualize the white man's gaze, and we can have a meta discussion about what that means as a white man doing that. Maybe that could be another episode if we continue to talk about these films. So my interpretation through the camera work alone is that this is Lockjaw objectifying Perfidia, not the film itself objectifying Perfidia. Bob grabs Perfidia's ass. It is Bob objectifying Perfidia? Am I objectifying my fiance when I grab their ass? It is demonstrated to us that Perfidia is hypersexual, and there's some there is some questions there, right? It raises a lot of red flags, especially it raises red flags just as a moviegoer, right? Just sitting down and taking in the movie. There's some red flags being raised, or at least should. Maybe not should, but at least from my background and biases and everything that informs me as a moviegoer, I'm catching on to a couple things. But especially if we apply a black feminist critique to this, and I'm particular in my phrasing there, right? A black feminist critique, because that is the critiques that I've been taking in and consuming, and I think there's something to be said about searching out specifically for a black feminist critique in this film, considering what the film is, right? That's just a little disclaimer. Now, is Bob objectifying Perfidia? No. This is their relationship. They are, I almost regret naming Perfidia hypersexual, because that's the phrase that has been fed to me. Because I don't know how hypersexual she really is. Explosions can be kind of sexy. They're kind of fun, the base of it. So Perfidia wanted to have sex as they're about to blow up this, power tower. We could apply that lens to this and criticize it in this way. I think it's just a funny moment. It's just a fun scene, right? Also, more than that, in that specific instance, and I apologize for jumping around. I'm going to reel it back in a second. In that specific instance, not only is it kind of fun, kind of funny, but it speaks to Perfidia's faux revolutionary identity. So we'll come back to that. So, what is One Battle After Another really about? It's just one individual's opinion. One Battle After Another is about the disillusionment post Inauguration Day 2009 and the loss of hope. Not only, in 2016, but throughout the Obama presidency. It's making a lot of statements about that. The disillusionment post 2009, and it offers up a remedy, and we'll get to that. I don't think there's any denying that this film is coming out of a liberal tradition. We can apply various leftist critiques to this film. Let's break down how PTA makes this about the disillusionment post 2009. Okay, as many of you probably know, the movie is based off a Pynchon, fuck if I know, book titled Vinland, I believe. Right in the very beginning of the movie, we are introduced to the French 75, this violent revolutionary group, and we're kind of in a timeless space. We don't really see cell phones too much, or at all, until after the time jump later on. And that timelessness is purposeful, right? What does the revolutionary in this analogy represent? It represents the democratic, liberal, faux revolution of 2009. This revolution, quote unquote, that was informed by years and years and decades and centuries of many, many things. A lot of work from a lot of different people. Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his interview or conversation with Ezra Klein after Charlie Kirk was assassinated, talks about, the generational struggle, right? How he knows there's ancestors of his that died in darkness, not being able to see the world that they created for him. Things don't happen from year to year, decade to decade. They happen generationally. So we learn through Perfidia's family that she comes to the revolution by inheritance, right? She's born into this. She's in some ways along for the ride. Is it her mother or her grand? I'm not sure. One of Perfidia's family members says she's a runner, And there's some insight there into the character of Perfidia. So this revolution emerges, right? All these great things are happening. They're blowing up banks. That's awesome. Who the fuck likes a bank? As far as we are aware, the only thing that the French 75 have destroyed is property, which, as we know, in a capitalistic society, that is the ultimate crime. When they go to rob the bank and Jungle Pussy hops up on top of the counter, here is another moment that the black feminist critique can very easily be applied, and has been by many people loads smarter than me. I am an individual with white skin, right? I am an individual who grew up in the 28208 zip code of Charlotte, North Carolina. My grandmother had bought a house in the neighborhood we all grew up in, long time ago, before the white flight. The white flight happened, and, my grandma said, I'm not moving. She had no reason to, right? Probably couldn't afford to anyway. You know what I mean? And I have an aunt who is differently abled, and when my mom was getting married and having kids, they made the decision to move back into it. So by the time that I'm growing up, what is it called? Minority, majority, right? I lived in that community, right? Most of my neighbors were black and brown. And what does that mean, right? It means lots and lots and lots of. Primarily in this instance, it means in this conversation, I am carrying with me all that entails. And as I said at the start, you will get to know me a little bit more as I don't want to just have a biography episode. But I did want to be clear about that, right? That there is no denying the fact that my lived experience is different from, literally every other person on earth, right? And then we can break down some categories further on. So, Jungle Pussy. she hops on that counter, takes her mask off. You see this? This is power. And it is. It is. In this society, a black woman leading a group to rob a bank is a heroic image. It is. And if you don't see that, then your own biases are informing that, I think. Always happy to have a continuing discussion. And I'm always happy to admit when I'm wrong and when my thought evolves and when I grow and all those things. So she's up on the counter and we hear a gunshot. I watched this movie in theater when it first came out, and that gunshot was piercing. It really struck through the air, I suppose, in a sense. And we don't cut immediately to what has happened. We stay on Jungle Pussy, and we see the shock, the reality of the violence has become clear. Because now this isn't violence against institution. It's not violence against a corrupt structure. It is violence against a brother who has been colonized. And that is fucked. If you're the French 75, if you're a black woman in the French 75, that kind of fucking sucks, right? Now, the revolution crumbles very quickly after this. They run. Some of them escape. Perfidia is caught. Lockjaw has, at this point, already coerced her into sex. The power dynamics in that, it's how do you recognize that as anything but rape, right? Where it gets confused to some people is the play of power dynamics in the sexual act itself. The thing that Lockjaw is turned on by is that submissiveness, is that reversal of the power roles. He's nervous, a loaded gun is at his head, but his cock is hard, But let's call it for what it is. Lockjaw rapes Perfidia. And now she is caught. He is the only person in the world who can help her. And she does what many of us would probably do. In fact, I would wager most people in this society would do what Perfidia does. Let me take a quick break. We'll be right back. And we are back. Lockjaw has become Perfidia's only hope for any sort of life outside of prison. And she folds. I think, applying a little empathy to this situation. Understandably so. Now, this revolution is met with reality and quickly crumbles. It cannibalizes itself. It allows empire to do what empire does. And then, 16 years later, this little tiny piece of narration is crucial to understanding this film, in my opinion. What was 16 years ago at the time this movie was released? 2009, right? Now, much has been written on the disappointment leftists had with the Obama presidency. I am of an age where I was a child in 2009 when he was being inaugurated. I recall it very clearly. We had school off. We watched the inauguration at home with my cousins came over. I guess because we were just watching. My mother was watching family, I suppose. I remember that very clearly. So I'm not going to delve too much into that. Much has been written on the failures and consequently disappointments in the Obama presidency. That is where I say this film comes out of a liberal tradition comes from. It comes out of that disillusionment. It comes out of that disappointment. It comes out of that loss of hope. Which, as I said, I was a kid. I was not around at the time for the leftist critique of Obama. I'm sure it existed. I'm sure it was there. Just as it exists today and is there today, very easily found. So a diagnosis is not enough, right? It's not enough for a doctor to tell you that you're sick. You want to know, how can I get better? And PTA seems to have some ideas about that. Seems to have some leftist ideas about that. The remedy to the loss of hope, to the disillusionment, is rooted in community and collective action. Sensei's, I hesitate to call it a subplot because I don't really. It certainly isn't, right? It's so important to the movie. I don't want to go, get too lost in some of this. My thoughts are kind of dotting a little bit. I do want to touch on and compare a couple scenes very early on in the film. They're in the car celebrating, drinking, and Perfidia asks Bob if he likes black girls. And Bob says, "Yeah, of course I like black girls. What do you think I'm doing here?" Now let's compare that to when Lockjaw asks Bob if he likes black girls. And Lockjaw, Sean Penn is so great in this movie. And it makes perfect sense knowing Sean Penn's politics this movie to do. Oh, I love them. Black girls, I love them. Whatever the fuck he says. And it's two very different things are happening. And the symmetry is purposeful. The symmetry is purposeful, right? Different things are happening here, and the motivations are different for these two characters, of course, right? It's interesting to me that it's framed this way. Bob's not volunteering this information, right? He's not a weirdo going around telling people how much he loves black girls, black women. Perfidia asks him, again, has a white individual who grew up in and out of black spaces, as in sometimes I was an observer, sometimes I was not an observer, sometimes I was a participant in these spaces, right? And as someone who has dated black women in the past, this is not an unfamiliar thing to happen. I'm sure, I'm positive I've been asked similar questions before. And it's kind of absurd, right? It's such a silly thing. And that's how I recognize that first scene, right? It's just, these are people who are family, adopted, familyness, and they're having fun. And now later on, we have the Lockjaw, which later directly connects to when, with Chase Infinity's character asks Lockjaw if he loved her mother. And Lockjaw doesn't answer. Like, he doesn't, Lockjaw is incapable of loving Perfidia. Incapable of it. How can a racist love a black woman? I mean, truly love a black woman. Unconditionally. Impossible, right? But you know what a racist does do is they objectify and they possess, right? Perfidia is Lockjaw's possession, and she escapes from that abuse. Should she have run from daughter? No. But, this is, when this film came out and this black feminist critique was emerging and then in the past few weeks kind of re-emerged, I get it. I understand taking issues with how Perfidia is written and portrayed if you're a black woman, right? Because how many people are going to watch this film uncritically and not think about a lot of these. So there very easily could be an argument that there is a net negative about releasing this movie as it is written and the themes it is. I don't believe that personally, but I think we could explore that argument. But I really, to me, Perfidia is a fully realized character. She's a fully realized woman, who's complicated and messy, kind of gross sometimes. And historically, especially when written by white men, but even black men and even women are guilty. Writing a black woman character with the characteristics was purposefully racist. There was an intent behind pushing stereotypes. I don't really recognize those stereotypes, Perfidia. Not as stereotypes. Not as, here are stereotypes, let's put them onto a character, if that makes sense at all. I think, let's break down Perfidia. We're introduced to her, she's already with Bob, she's a leader in this movement. She's with Bob, but she's also kind of a libertine, which Bob seems to be totally, who cares? And she finds herself in a game of cat and mouse with Lockjaw in which she is raped. And then she's pregnant, right? And who could the father be? Is a fair question. Excuse me. Who is the father, right? And is it Bob's? Is it Lockjaw's? If it is Lockjaw's, what does that mean? She carries the baby to term. She has the baby, and she has postpartum on top of all the rest of this. She does a thing that a lot of mothers have done, and she leaves. She's overwhelmed. Like, this is a realistic thing. This happens. This is real. This is familiar. It's not good. It's not our favorite thing in the world. But we know this happened, and then get caught, snitches, and now she's trapped by Lockjaw, and she runs cause she's a runner. And we don't. She does the narration. We don't hear from her again until the end of the film, in which a letter she had written to Chase Infinity's character is read, and it doesn't offer a lot of excuses in the letter. Clearly at some point on the run, like, she had this realization of, oh fuck, what have I done? And how could I have done things differently? And my child, I have no connection with. And in it is the acknowledgments that she has failed. Right here, PTA is speaking to his own daughters. He and his generation has failed his children's generation, right? But he has these strong, beautiful daughters, and he sees in them the hope for tomorrow. He sees in them the answers to our problems today. And I think there's something beautiful in that. I think there's something powerful in that. Yeah, I guess, we'll leave it there for one battle after another. I've talked longer than I intended to about it. Sinners. Brilliant, beautiful film. Ryan Coogler is a masterful writer-director. Really arguably at the top of the game right now. I mean, yeah, arguably at the top of the game. Certainly has a cultural and economic cachet right now with the success of Sinners. This film came out of his attempts to do an up-to-date Blade adaptation for Marvel, and that didn't happen. It couldn't get off the ground. So he transformed some of those ideas into Sinners. Sinners is kind of a dense film. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of subtext to be explored here that I simply don't have the knowledge or capability to fully explore. Lots has been written and said about this film as well. The Dr. Jared Bell has some interesting anti-capitalist critique of Sinners, which I found very interesting and enlightening. I can't remember the article in which he was reading from and kind of basing the discussion but has a jumping off point. And it talks about black entrepreneurism and black capitalism, and those being futile answers ultimately, and how Ryan Coogler seems to be pushing this pro-black entrepreneurship message. I think that would be a valid critique. Ultimately, I do not think that is what Ryan Coogler is doing with Sinners. The thing that I would like to explore, and the thing that I feel I have any value to add to this conversation, if any, right, is kind of exploring some of the statements the film is making on empire and colonialism. And I would like to demonstrate that Sinners is anti-capital. First, let's talk about the antagonist. He is a vampire from Ireland. Why? Why is he a vampire from Ireland? Is it just so that Ryan Coogler can discuss Pan-African themes in a film that is digestible to mainstream white audiences? Perhaps. There's something to be said about that, right? I don't think we can ignore, especially as artists, I don't think we can totally ignore commercial considerations always. And we can't ignore that as critics if we're critiquing things. Now, why an Irish vampire? We learned from him that he wasn't always this way, right? At some undisclosed time, and we don't know exactly when. There's some theories that are floated online. We know that he himself is bitten, I don't know, taken over, I don't know, introduced into the coven. I don't fucking know how vampires work. And the framing of it is clearly, the framing of it is clearly a vampire invasion coincides with the English colonial project in Ireland. And that's the main thing, right? He became a vampire in the immediate aftermath of Britain's colonial efforts in Ireland, right? Like we can break down and get into the nitty gritty of exact dates and how old this guy is, blah, 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 blah. I don't know if Ryan Coogler knows those dates, because ultimately it doesn't matter, really, right? The point in that is about empire and colonialism and how the colonized carry on and reinforce empire. Choosing an Irish person for this is brilliant, right? It encapsulates some of the arguments that Ryan Coogler is presenting. That alone is anti-capitalist, right? That alone of making these comparisons and drawing our attention to these things is an anti-capitalist act. Now, the specific charge about what is it, Smoke and Stack, their entrepreneurship, and that being an example of Ryan Coogler's conservatism, which sounds so absurd to me, personally. It is only when black men try to buy into the system that they are then corrupted by empire. Let me say that again. It is only when black men try to buy into the system that they are then corrupted by empire. If it suits empire's needs and wants to vampirize, right, to make one of us a black man, then they'll do that. Because of course they will. Because they always have, right? It doesn't give that specific black man any more real power. Of course it doesn't. And that this entrepreneurship attempt results not only in their corruption, but in the death of family and friends. The ending then, in which the Ku Klux Klan comes on through. After this one brother, he makes it through all of it, right? He dodges all that bullshit. He gets through to the sunrise. And it doesn't matter. Empire is still coming. And empire and white supremacy cannot be separated. They go hand in hand. They go tandem. It's kind of that in and of itself is kind of a nihilistic diagnosis. I don't know if I am finding the answers to the question being raised in the film. They may be there and I just haven't thought too deeply about it yet. Often, I don't think the answers necessarily matter. Just because we framed one battle after another in such a way of, here's a question, here's an answer. That doesn't mean Sinners needs to do the same thing. Of course not. It would be absurd. So yeah, I don't know if there's any answer, and it's not necessarily even the answer to a question of how do we combat this. It is positing something we can do, which is return to our roots, right? In Ryan Coogler's exploration of, or research, I should say, for Blade. He visited Africa, right? And from my understanding is he emerged that with a new Pan-African understanding. And we see that on film, certainly. Later on, there's this, like, rejection of the church. There's a rejection of Christianity after... Oh, Lord. I can't remember the character's name. The blues player. He's survived. And comes back to the church, his father's church, who, this congregation does not freak out at the appearance of this young man. He's cut up, he's bloody, he's bleeding. His father takes him in his arms, but he says, reject the thing you love, and this, my thing, will solve your problem. A familiar positioning from religious figures, irregardless of the religion. What does that rejection mean, right? He doesn't become a gospel singer, he stays a blues singer. What does that rejection mean? I think it's probably a rejection of empire, a rejection of white supremacy, a rejection of whiteness with a W, with the capital W. Whiteness as in the culture forced upon all of society. Lots of things happening. And again, much smarter people than me have commented on this. Ultimately, what I walked away from Sinners with is we must go to the past to find the answers for tomorrow. It'll be fascinating to see if or when Ryan Coogler and everybody do Sinners 2, how these themes are expounded upon now that our protagonist is a vampire, assuming that that's the route that they would go with. Ultimately, both of these films are incredible, beautiful, masterfully made, both of them. Both of them, I hope I have shown a little bit why they are leftist films that are anti-empire. I hope I've shown that a little bit. At the start of this, I talked about the tribes we find ourselves in at the Oscars. One battle after another versus Sinners. Who fucking cares? It's the Oscars. I like when my favorite thing wins just as much as the next cinephile, But both of these films are ultimately leftist films, I believe. And so why are we fighting over it? Why are we arguing over which one's better, which one deserves to win what? It's kind of absurd, and ultimately, probably, I think it's a psyop from Empire. It's just another distraction for us to worry about. And instead of really exploring these movies and really taking the most that we can out of them for ourselves and for our culture and our communities, we're angry our favorite didn't win. Lost in a lot of this discourse was a Brazilian film, The Secret Agent. Better than even Sinners did, I believe. The Secret Agent really shows just the consequences of a fascist government, right? Of empire. Why do I think The Secret Agent was better at some of this? I think it was better at humanizing the character. We feel deep emotion, just like the lead of The Secret Agent. We're along for the journey. Really, the whole point of The Secret Agent is to humanize the victims of a dictatorship, right? Why hasn't The Secret Agent been more in the discourse? I'm sure it has, and I'm just not clicked into it, perhaps. But one reason The Secret Agent was never going to win: empire and capital hate when we humanize its consequences. Just like the alt-right, the far-right hate when we humanize the consequences of the Holocaust. Just like when Zionists hate when we humanize the consequences of the genocide in Gaza. Why do we humanize? It's not for the opposition. It's not. They are the ones dehumanizing, right? The point of humanizing is not for the opposition. It's for the bystanders. It's for the people on the sidelines. It's for those watching and listening, but don't feel strongly, perhaps. I don't know. We humanize so that empire and capital cannot escape the consequences of those things, right? That's the hope. It's the dream. I don't know. Fuck. Well, it is now 1 o'clock. That's all for me, folks. Thank you for listening. Please continue to follow along.
Senseless violence in its senseless tragedy.
Uninformed Opinions. Uninformed Opinions.